It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I apologize in advance for opening this workshop by lowering the tone and the mood to talk about when resilience goes bad. But as I hope to show, it's quite important that we begin to understand and complicate some of our ideas about resilience, as I say a little later, to move away from the sort of sprightly positivity that is ordinarily associated with the concept. Now, I hope I am going to get this right. We're going to discover that's not right. That is right. Okay. So, look, let me begin with a few critical considerations. So I think in order to understand what happens when resilience goes bad, first of all, we have to understand what we mean when we think about good or prosocial resilience. And there are a few common assumptions about resilience that I'd really like to challenge and unpack along the way. So the first of those is that resilience is inherently prosocial. But actually it's not. Because when we start to explore how resilience is defined, as we will in a moment, in social-ecological terms, we're going to see that definitionally speaking, resilience can be both value-laden, but also, as in, associated with the positive, but also quite value-neutral, and that behaviors and systems can be maladaptive or antisocial and certainly still be classed as resilient. So the second assumption or myth that I would like to challenge is that higher levels of individual and community resilience are always indicators of a healthy society, which they're not, and that adaptive capacity is always a positive, and it isn't. Now, it may be the case, but it's not always the case. So individual and community level resilience can sometimes be responses to deeply unhealthy societies. So this idea that somehow resilient individuals and communities proxy for a broader healthy society, lots and lots of evidence to show that that's not the case. But it's also true that persistent, or what you might call overly persistent, adaptive capacity in the face of toxic environments can sometimes be more harmful than helpful because it continues to emphasize micro-level and meso-level rather than macro or systemic change. So sometimes you're actually better falling apart and collapsing in order to drive systemic change rather than continuing to bear individually or at a more local community level this extraordinary burden of always trying to adapt to the unadaptable. So the third thing that I'd like to unpick a bit is the idea that the relationship of resilience to extremism is always an oppositional one. So that is that resilience always somehow equals opposition to resilience as a social harm. Because I think this really occludes the way in which extremist belief systems can themselves not only demonstrate great resilience, but can also reflect adaptive, although I would say largely maladaptive resilience in the face of crisis or adversity. So these three assumptions are interrelated and to some extent I think interdependent, but as I hope to show, they all need to be critically scrutinized. But first, let's go to some background and definition on both resilience and extremism. So, and I will try to not spend too much time dwelling on this, but looking at some of the theories, concepts, and frameworks around resilience, the idea that resilience is prosocial, I think, is very much linked to its genealogy as a concept. So, as I'm sure most of you know, the Latin root of resilience, resilio, meaning to jump or to leap back, and so we get that popular idea that resilience somehow is to bounce back. I always like to say, people are not tennis balls. They don't just, sort of bounce back from hard times. There is a bounce in the engineering and physics world where you have the idea of materials that sort of return to a steady state or equilibrium after experiencing shock or trauma. But in human terms, there is increasingly, I think, although there are a number of different disciplinary-based definitions of resilience, increasingly some consensus around the idea that what we mean when we talk about human resilience is the capacity of individuals, communities, to adapt, cope, and thrive when exposed to often sustained trauma, crisis, or adversity. There is no resilience without adversity. When everything's going well, you don't need to be resilient. So it's something that actually emerges as a response to crisis or adversity. So our modern understanding of resilience really begins in the 20th century. You had a group of researchers who did, really some quite extraordinary work on why children were able to thrive in often very highly dysfunctional families or broader environments. And that group of researchers in the 1940s through about the 1970s started to move away from this pathology-based understanding of resilience as always involving some level of victimization and risk. And what they started to analyze, I think quite closely and empirically, was what the strengths and attributes and protections were that children were able to draw on to enable their thriving, in these really extraordinarily difficult environments. So this more developmentally oriented construct of resilience really emphasized the importance of those protective factors and resources that people can draw on when they're dealing, with difficulty and challenge, and how they interact with vulnerability factors, those things that can weaken or erode our capacity to adapt and to cope when we're faced with challenges. So just also to be clear, vulnerability factors, when we talk about those are features or dynamics that pose risks and threats to healthy and stable human functioning, and they can include things like abuse, poverty, neglect, social or economic marginalization, discrimination, exposure to sustained conflict or violence, and so on. Protective factors are those things that we draw on, again, features and resources in our environment, and environments can be very, very, we are all systems, right? So as an individual, we are a system. There are some elements that are associated with innate resilience that we can draw on that are protective factors, but equally there are things in our local environments, families, school, friends, and then broadening out that we can draw on when dealing with adversity because they help shield us from the risks or impacts of dysfunction, and they can help enable recovery from trauma or adversity through external support, providing sense of agency or efficacy to support adaptive capacity, and so forth. So, as I referred to earlier, that sprightly positivity of popular resilience discourse. If you've watched I don't know if reality television has come your way here in the Netherlands, but series like Survivor or Alone, which do focus on individual resilience and pay out almost no recognition of the resources in the environment that enable these people to be able to get through every episode, and still come out alive. So there is that kind of a fairly banal positivity associated with popular ideas about resilience, but it's understandable in one sense because we do associate resilience with protective features, with well-being, and with thriving. But the social-ecological model of resilience, which is quite a bit more nuanced than that, really tends to home in on the relational, interactive, and multi-systemic ecology of resilience. And that concept of the ecology of resilience, I think, is the strongest contribution of this model. So the idea of this complex interplay between individual capacities and circumstances with environmental and contextual risks and resources and protections and vulnerabilities, and the interaction of those things with broader systemic functioning, dysfunction, or breakdown. Now, if you look at the literature on the social-ecological resilience framework, you see that there are a few things that continue to emerge over and over again. The idea that resilience is a multifactorial, context-dependent process. It's not a state. Resilience is not a state or a condition. So it's something that can grow, that can strengthen, but it's also something that can weaken, erode, or indeed break down. As I said before, resilience can't occur without the presence of both adaptive functioning, but also exposure to strain, risk, or adversity. So doesn't work, it's not there when everything is going well. Our resilience capacity is very much governed in this model by the quality, accessibility, scale, and meaningfulness of the resources that are available to us across many different systems. Individual, education, family, community, mental health, justice, employment, all of those systems are part of the resilience ecology for individuals and for communities. And they matter when the going gets tough, and they matter because they are interacting constantly with our own innate capacities, but you can never just rely on individual traits or attributes to be able to understand resilience. It's also the case that resilience demonstrates equifinality. So the idea that there, I think, Jakob, you alluded to this earlier, there are a range of different pathways that can lead to, the different but equally viable manifestations of resilient thriving and well-being. That's always mediated, though, by levels and perceptions around risk and cultural and social meaningfulness. And the last point that you really see emphasized heavily in the literature relates to this idea of the culturally and socially meaningful. So resilience resources need to be culturally and socially meaningful for the people who are using them, because if they're not going to be perceived as resources at all by the people who need them most. And the little example I like to give when I'm talking about this aspect from my own country. So we had a lot of colonial explorers in Australia who, went out into the desert. They were trying to map what they saw as the unknown parts of Australia. Of course, they'd been known to Indigenous Australians for many, many millennia. And they got out there, and it looked like a desert because it was desert. There were resources in that desert, including water. And had they listened to some of the indigenous people and knowledge who were trying to tell them where the water was, they would have survived. But they couldn't listen because their framework was, we know better, we're scientific, you people just have primitive beliefs, and they died. Okay, so they did not have a resilient response. They were not open to new learning. They were not able, and the resources that existed out in the desert that were culturally meaningful for indigenous inhabitants were not culturally meaningful for colonial British explorers, and they died as a result. So I think that's, tries to make that example clear in one sense. So look, just to move on, just to recap then, social-ecological resilience, we can understand it as an interactive and multi-systemic process generating and making accessible and culturally meaningful different levels, scales, and types of resources that help support and strengthen our ability to adapt and thrive in the context of adversity and challenge. Now, Mike Ungar, who's quite a well-known resilience scholar, Mike likes to say that resilience is as much about what we receive from those around us as what we have or what we, or are as individuals. This is not to diminish ideas around individual moral responsibility, for example, around resilience. I think that's a separate question. But Mike's point is that it's never simply an individual engagement, and that often, although particularly in neoliberal terms, we like to ascribe more power to individuals than they rightly can be said to possess, we downplay the environmental ecological context in which resilience develops and thrives at our peril. However, the thriving that we know is core to resilient development can manifest in antisocial rather than prosocial ways. And this is when we start to talk about maladaptive rather than prosocial resilience. And maladaptive resilience tends to emerge particularly when the social ecology in which resilience is navigated, when people are trying to navigate their way to resources that are going to help them cope, when that social ecology is itself deficient or struggling with broader vulnerabilities, so that the most meaningful resources in a person's local environment might be those that simultaneously create harms for themselves, for others, while appearing to offer coping and strengthening mechanisms, and in fact sometimes genuinely offering coping and strengthening mechanisms. So one of the paradoxes that this idea that if you have a weak or dysfunctional social ecology that is providing harmful resources, then your resilience is going to be maladaptive. What you get when that happens is what I've called a transactional risk economy. So this is where the response to environmental stressors that pose risks and create vulnerabilities for a person or group, you've got this set of challenges, A over here, they simply exchange those coping strategies they exchange them for coping strategies that pose new risks and create new vulnerabilities. And of course, this is what Mahdiani and Ungar term the dark side of resilience. So let me just give you a little example of what I'm talking about here. So this is a hypothetical but pretty realistic scenario from Australia. Let's say you've got a young fellow, lives in an ordinary Australian suburb in a major capital city, and he's struggling with poverty. He's a teenager, maybe 17 or so, and he's struggling with poverty and with family dysfunction and with lack of status and self-respect in his life. And he has negative experiences with the education and social support systems available in his community. He leaves school, but he can't find a stable job. The welfare benefit scheme that he's eligible for does not provide enough to meet his basic needs for housing, food, and transport. And all of these are realities in some communities in Australia today. So he becomes quite resentful, particularly when he sees new refugee arrivals getting what his family, friends, and social media feeds call handouts and special treatment. So he's already in an environment that has a particular ideological approach, to how we balance the distribution of goods and services across different cohorts within the community. And he's resentful because he sees them getting what he considers to be handouts and special treatment while he struggles to meet his basic needs. And he feels that he's worth less in society's eyes than people who can access and benefit from these resources. So in social capital terms, we would say that this young person has quite weak or low resilience capital. Yeah, so resilience capital is a little different than social capital. Now, if he becomes involved with a violent extremist network, for example, one focused on anti-immigration or white supremacist ideology, he may find that his access to coping resources actually increases. He might be able to access practical resources such as housing or employment through the group that he joins. He may find friends and social networks that make him feel wanted and valued by a new family. He might feel that he's learning and growing through the education resources, and I put education in quotes, provided as part of the group's recruitment and indoctrination efforts. And he might also find that his sense of grievance, victimization, and lack of efficacy are now turned into an opportunity, or perceived by him to be turned into an opportunity for action with meaning and purpose, which allows him to feel better about himself and his place in the world through adopting new forms of agency and identity frames. So this is a slightly lengthy way of saying that he has radicalized, but he has radicalized in a way that reflects a resilient response. And it is a resilient response to his circumstance. Why do I say that? He has decreased some of the risks and vulnerabilities present in his earlier environment. He's navigated his way to resources that have been enabled by those who target vulnerable youth and offer them remedies for their unmet needs and grievances that help him feel that he's coping and even beginning to thrive. But it's also maladaptive because his resilient response and his swapping out of one set of harms and risks for another set of harms and risks sends him in a very high-risk direction for both others and himself. So it includes things like, what are the risks? Harm to others, arrest, incarceration, loss of life for him, as well as others if he mobilizes to violent extremist action, harm from the group that he's joined, the violent extremist group, if he becomes disenchanted and tries to exit, and of course the many multi-level risks to community cohesion caused by the violent extremist ideology and actions to which he's committed. But let's go back for a moment to the social ecology in which this young person's resilient choices have been made. What would his individual resilient response look like if more prosocial rather than maladaptive resources had been available? Because I think we can see in that scenario that I outlined to you that there are sort of various both proximal and distal touch points at which we can see where the resource environment that he's been operating in has been deficient or at least suboptimal. So some of those issues are broadly systemic. a welfare system that doesn't provide enough for your basic needs, tick in Australia, housing system that cannot cope with demand, tick in Australia, an education system that is itself too overwhelmed and under-resourced, especially if you're in a state-run school in a poorer neighborhood, to be able to see and respond to individual learning and social needs. Then there are also the more proximal systemic gaps and shortcomings, family dysfunction that hasn't been mediated by appropriate child protection or family services. He's tried to seek counseling, perhaps, for his family problems. Told he has to wait 6 months for an appointment, tick, in Australia. His efforts to find work, are undermined by the lack of youth employment opportunities outside an extraordinarily precarious and unstable gig economy. So all of these things are genuine challenges, and they demonstrate that those with weak or inadequate resilience capital, if they're also trying to operate within a weak or inadequate resource environment, they are going to end up making choices that help them cope or thrive, but that may very well be maladaptive. So there is a little diagram, and I just want to show you here. So this sort of sketches out, where we are. This young fellow, I'm just going to come out here for a minute. This young fellow is here. So the question for him is, what do we need to do to drive him towards those prosocial resources that are going to push him into Q1? Because otherwise, he's going to end up going in that direction over into Q3 towards the antisocial resources, which is exactly what we've seen him do in the hypothetical scenario that I've outlined. So I think that both the specifics in this scenario and the wider social ecology in which these dynamics sit really has invited us to consider, targeting our resilience efforts, not only at how we equip individuals and communities to resist harmful influences or mechanisms for coping, but it asks us to consider how we develop and maintain more resilient systems that both can provide support but also can themselves be supported, which is something that we don't talk about very much. And I want to turn now to, looking at how this has played out, for example, in the harmful forms of extremism that we've seen escalate and amplify and diversify thanks to the acute system shocks and crises of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so Rick touched on this earlier. We've seen the rise of conspiracy theory, extreme right, ethno-nationalism, sovereign citizen movements, and extreme misogyny. These modes of extremism, I would suggest, have served as a resilience resource themselves for some, maladaptive, but they are resilience resources on one level, because they have provided the perception or the experience of certainty, clarity, boundaries, and structure in a wildly oscillating cognitive and behavioral landscape of risk and threat. But they've also provided a range of secondary resilience resources, and those secondary resources arise through the emergence and the maintenance of extremist social networks, which is absolutely a phenomenon that we need to understand and that we can never ignore other than at our peril. So unfortunately, these are all overwhelmingly maladaptive resilience resources because they do indeed create new forms of harm and challenge, even as they appeared to help cope with or address others. Now, the broader multi-systemic environment in which the escalation of these harmful forms of extremism occurred includes things like the erosion or the absence of trust systems between citizens and government, and also between citizens and institutions and scientific knowledge in a very demoralizingly significant number of countries. And the impact of this, and I'm thinking here particularly about vaccine resistance and refusal as the result of a set of extremist beliefs around science and around the body. The impact of that was not just cognitive, okay? This wasn't just about people disappearing down some cognitive, rabbit hole. People died. People who refused vaccines died, and they died when they didn't have to die, yeah? And arguably, more of those people who became vaccine anti-vax activists or vaccine refusers, arguably more people died through that route than through terrorist or violent extremist actions during the same time period. So it's actually quite sobering to start to think about some of those comparisons. Now, those impacts, I would say, rest in turn on a still deeper erosion, and that is one ushered in by decades of neoliberal policy that has dismantled our ideas and our commitment to collective civic responsibility and action, and instead what we've had is the increasing drum roll of responsibilizing individuals for their own economic, social, educational, and health-based well-being, because we have told them consistently, particularly in societies like mine in Australia, that public systems will not or cannot meet their needs as those public systems formerly did. So effectively the message is, be resilient even if it kills you, right? And this kind of messaging says you're on your own, and only your own individual or very localized adaptive capacity is going to rescue you from collapse or worse. So the big problem here, of course, and this is another form of maladaptive resilience, let me just be clear about that. The big problem here is that this creates scenarios in which people continue to try to adapt to circumstances that may be so toxic or harmful that thriving is never going to be possible. You're never going to be able to thrive in some environments. But the idea that you have to keep thriving itself becomes the harm, yes? So you can be overly persistent in your adaptive capacity. And in some ways, collapse would be much more efficacious because it might actually prompt social change, or it might prompt recognition that adaptation is simply not going to be possible. And of course, it prevents us from identifying and targeting those systemic problems that chronically challenge well-being and the ability to meet individual and community needs. And I think this is where we see forms of extremism that really do begin to thrive as maladaptively resilient responses to both acute and chronic crises and challenges. So, I've argued elsewhere being one of the forthcoming books in the Extreme Belief series, that radicalization is a process that involves transformation and momentum, but that extremism, by contrast, is a structure of rigid and exclusivist beliefs. It's intolerant of any diversity or dissent, and it's committed to maintaining very strict boundaries between what is inside, right, so this is drawing partly on J.M. Berger's in-out group dynamics, maintaining very strict boundaries between what's inside, which is to say, what is clean, what is sacred, what is permissible, and what is outside, which is to say, what is forbidden, what is polluted, what is taboo. So the wonderful anthropologist Mary Douglas, and the work that she did in the 1960s on purity and danger, if we follow the logic that she outlined there, we would say that extremism involves a highly intensive mode of symbolic and sometimes literal boundary maintenance, right? Very much about boundaries. Boundaries around bodies, around territories, and around beliefs. And so the question becomes, well, under what circumstances can extremism itself, as a system, as a belief system, serve as a maladaptive resilience resource or method of coping? And I think one answer comes from what complexity theorists term polycrisis, which Mark Swilling defines as a nested set of globally interactive socio-economic, ecological, and cultural institutional crises that defy reduction to a single cause. Now, polycrisis as a concept is not without its critics. A number of people have said, multiple cascading and intersecting crises are nothing new in human history. But I think what matters for the consideration of extremism as a maladaptive resilience resource is the experience of polycrisis, the experience of being or feeling overwhelmed cognitively, psychologically, emotionally, on the cusp of not being able to cope, Yeah, this is what matters when we're thinking about resilience, both to and of extremism. And I think there's very little question, at least for me, that the COVID-19 pandemic was experienced as a polycrisis by many people and societies and countries and systems around the world. It brought a range of economic and health and social and political and psychological systems pretty much to breaking point. Created an acute set of multi-level systemic shocks and crises in which both hyper-resilience but also the collapse of resilience featured simultaneously. Sometimes that happened sequentially, and sometimes it happened in a more oscillating kind of fashion. But I think most of all, what we saw happen during that acute period was the creation of a climate of very profound and durable uncertainties. So uncertainties and the disruption of a set of complacencies and assumptions around health, around risk, around political power, particularly the reach of the state into people's lives and democratic societies, around economic stability, about our relationships with loved ones, about our relationship with science, and about our relationships both with our own bodies and also with the bodies of others. Every single one of those domains was disrupted, and every single one of those systems experienced some level or some form of shock. So in such an environment, why are we surprised that extremist beliefs, which appear to offer, as I'll show in a moment, certain things, that they can begin to look and feel like a coping mechanism? Why do I say that? Because they offer the appearance or the experience of structure and causal clarity. Never mind that it's an illusion, the experience is what it appears to offer. So this includes the assigning of things like blame, fault, responses. So everybody remembers, right? It was the Chinese, it was the government, it was immigrants, it was big pharma. Promote your own sense, promote the sense of efficacy. So that mantra of conspiracy theorists, particularly during COVID, when we saw QAnon really get its legs. QAnon got its legs before COVID, but it found new lease on life with COVID. Do your own research, right? Do your own research and ignore any credible research, which should have been the follow-on from that. Rigidly policing boundaries around what is permissible and what is not permissible to say or to do or to think or to feel. And it also, they offer the appearance of creating and sustaining, well, actually, this isn't just an appearance, this is a real thing for people, social networks and sense of collective belonging. And that sense of collective belonging was often about feeling that they belonged to a group of people who thought that they had pierced the veil of deception, perpetrated by the state or by the elites or the corporations, whoever, to grasp the perceived reality that they thought lay behind all this. But it also highlighted, I think, a lot of deeper fault lines that we're still trying to reckon with and that threaten resilience in one form or another. And those are things like social polarization, the mainstreaming of extremist political rhetoric so that it has become normalized by a number of political parties and political actors in a number of countries, the inequalities of north-south global healthcare and scientific capital and economic power, and what I referred to earlier, the rising lack of trust in government and institutional capacity, and the lack of belief that institutions can any longer respond effectively to crises. So all of these things have served to amplify, but also to legitimate extremist beliefs in the eyes of some people. And I think this represents a really wicked problem for resilience theory because, on the one hand, extremist belief systems are showing us time and time again that they have the ability to be hardy and to be nimble and to be adaptive. But on the other hand, they are profoundly maladaptive and often antisocial on the other, and that is a wicked problem. So I'm just coming to the end now. Here are, and this is, thanks to Michael Ungar, who's done amazing work in this space, and who, in a terrific meta-review of the resilience literature back in 2018, identified 7 features of multi-systemic resilience that come out over and over again. And those are the 7, which I'm not going to read out to you, but you can look at them while I'm speaking. So, one of the core features of multi-systemic resilience is openness to new information, the capacity to integrate environmental and systemic shocks, and the initiation of new behavior regimes as an adaptive response to adversity or stress. Now, extremist systems can demonstrate many of these adaptive capabilities, right? They are open to some new information. They are actually very, very good at integrating environmental and systemic shocks and making meaning out of them. It doesn't matter whether the meaning is real, based in a sort of reality consensus, and people often make the mistake and think that extremism is incoherent or that it's illogical, but it's actually neither of those things. It always has a logic for the people, who are within those systems. So it demonstrates some adaptive capability, but extremist systems also demonstrate rigidity, and they are closed rather than open in orientation. That's a big part of what being extremist is that you are closed to things that fall outside, that are seen as polluted, that are seen as corrupting, that are seen as problematic in one way or another. And they often have little or no diversity or redundancy. In fact, redundancy in particular, the idea that you have options and backups in different ways and different systems, redundancy is almost anathema to extremist systems on a number of levels. So understanding the resilience of extremist belief systems, both where they have the capacity to adapt and thrive, but also some of those pressure points or weaknesses, is really critical if we're thinking about how we build resilience to them and how we develop effective interventions. So any intervention that wants to change thinking or behavior requires both high and deep thresholds of social and cultural literacy to be successful. So you can't change what you don't understand. And I'm thinking, certainly in my own context, about the success or failure of public health campaigns, right, around things like wearing a seatbelt or smoking, or in fact vaccine uptake. So making that connection between the social ecology of extremisms, on the one hand, because extremist belief systems also sit within a social ecology. So making that connection between the social ecology of extremisms, on the one hand, and the social ecology of resilience, on the other, is really important if we're going to develop higher impact intervention capacity. Like public health challenges, extremisms right across the ideological and political spectrum are always contextual, they're always contingent, and they're always in dynamic interplay with both swiftly and slowly moving undercurrents of social and political flux. And navigating these sort of rapids and narrows in order to determine the kinds of resilience-building measures that are going to be most effective in any given context, whether that context is social or ideological or cultural or place-based or digital, all of it calls for sustained learning and interaction between communities and practitioners and policymakers. And I like to call this the slow resilience movement, like the slow food movement, the slow resilience movement, because durable resilience building actually takes time. And one of the perpetual problems, I think, in this space from a policy perspective is that government agencies and policymakers often want the quick fix, and the speedy or maximalized efficient route to things, and resilience is very resistant to being hurried along, and that's something that makes it difficult in policy terms. So, very last slide, you'll be delighted to hear. At their best, however, resilient strategies are most likely to be both effective and sustainable if they are themselves resilient. So if we develop models of pro-social resilience to harmful forms of extremism that are adaptive, for example, adaptive to the emergence of new threats and new resources and untapped capacities, that are open to learning and experimentation, for example, incorporating majority culture and government resilience indicators into our models. It is astonishing the number of resilience indicators that tend to focus only on perceived vulnerable or minority communities, and they almost never bend their gaze or their lens back to say, are the agencies, the governments responsible for funding and sustaining resilient, how resilient are they? So we need to widen that aperture. able to absorb systemic shocks, for example, shifts in the profile and tactics of extremist movements, and indeed also systemic shocks that can arise from the risk appetite, whether it rises or falls, the risk appetite of governments. Able to initiate new behavioral regimes, for example, modifying definitions, resources, relationships, structures, in our context-dependent resilience programming. And finally, I think a really important point is, being able to negotiate new resources through complex but also reciprocal relationships. For example, through respectful and genuine partnerships with an expanded range of civil society and institutional actors who may be newly relevant to changing circumstances and contexts. Often in resilience programming, when you get out into the real world of where this stuff is done and not just talked about, you see resilience programming that is trying to cope with new threats and new risks by going to the same old partners who are actually not the partners who are so relevant anymore. They're not the agencies that are really going to be able to, or the non-government organizations that are going to be able to cope. So that in itself, reflects a kind of lack of adaptive capacity. So if we can do some of these things, then I think building resilience to extremism, recognizing it as a form of maladaptive coping under certain circumstances at certain times, and then building resilience to harmful forms of extremism because of their maladaptive payload can become a more durable and productive prospect. And that's it. Thank you very much.